Hello, everyone. I'm Michelle Hausman. I'm the artistic director of Miami New Drama. We are a theater company homed at the Colony Theater on Lincoln Road. That is the heart of Miami Beach and South Beach. And we are a different type of theater company that most people are familiar with. We mainly do new works, world premieres. We create plays working directly with playwrights, commissioning them. So most of the work we do has never been produced before. And we're also a theater company that is as multicultural, multilingual, multi-ethnical as the community we live in, which is South Florida, Miami. It is one of the most diverse regions in America, but America is slowly catching up and becoming as diverse as we are. So we get to have the wonderful opportunity of imagining what the future of the American theater can be like. And that's the work we try to produce. So that's a little bit about us, in case you hadn't heard about the company before. And we currently have a world premiere production hibernating at the Colony Theater. It's a musical called A Wonderful World, about the life and music of Louis Armstrong. It's extraordinary. It's the most ambitious play we've done. And it's sitting at the Colony Theater. So since then, we've decided to create this free platform in which we share with some of our wonderful friends and people in our network knowledge. We created this MasterMiND class. And today, I'm extremely excited about today's MasterMiND class. Our guest lecturer today is one of the brightest and extraordinary theater professionals that I know. I met Mr. Schrader about a decade ago or so, when I approached him with the idea that I was still living in New York at the time, that I wanted to move to Miami and create this vision of what I just described, this regional theater that is a representation of the time and place where we're living in. And by that time, I was a grad student at Columbia University, and David was the vice president, the managing director of Disney Theatrical. And I asked him for a meeting. A friend, mutual friend, introduced us, and David took the time to meet with me, invited me to lunch, was 100% concentrated in the conversation we were having. He was invested in that conversation. And it was really extraordinary for me. You know, in the theater world, very few people are really gonna give you the time, especially at that level. The managing director of the largest theater company in the world really took the time to talk to me. And since then, we've developed a friendship that eventually, once Miami New Drama became a reality, and then I invited David to join the board of directors, and he agreed, and has been completely transformational for the company to have a mind like him really being invested in the work we're doing here at Miami New Drama. It's a longer introduction than normal, but I just want to, and I haven't even spoken about his achievements, professional achievements. So he arrived at Disney Theatrical when he was just beginning, the very first year the company was beginning, or very second year. And so he, was the producer of The Lion King and The Little Mermaid and Aladdin and Mary Poppins and Newsies and all these extraordinary musicals that came out of Disney. He was the managing director at the time, had the front row seat of a transformation of the theater field. Disney came and completely transformed the theater field. So I'm excited about the conversation we're gonna have today with David. But I had to tell that story of how we met, because David is a mensch. He's an extraordinary human being, invested in what he's doing. He's kind, he's exceptional. I am the biggest fan of David Schrader. And so welcome, Mr. Schrader, to this masterclass. at Miami New Drama. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks. Good to see you.
Likewise. We're good to go.
Thank you for that intro. I feel as though I was more a witness to the events you're describing than a participant, but here we go. And I'm hoping we'll have a conversation today. There's a bunch of stuff we could talk about, and I love having a conversation with you because you think well and you make me think, you elevate the conversation. And part of that comes from where you're going is what the goal is, what you're trying to do, right? And I'm going to switch back and forth between thinking about local, because all theater is really local. It's handmade, it's all crafted, right? But then what does it mean, and what's life, and how should I think about this? What could I do with the show? Like, it gets bigger when you start thinking about it. And that's why I think thinking about it's fun. It's interesting. It goes interesting places. We've talked about a couple of things we could talk about today. I just want to talk about theater for a minute, talk about sort of business, because that's where I come at it from, the accounting and finance world. And then we're going to talk thematically sort of how they fit together, why they're intertwined, what use we make of it. We could talk, and I think it might be surprising to talk about how big the theater business is, domestically, not-for-profit wise, worldwide. As you said, you used the word, it's sort of sleeping, it's hibernating, dormant for the moment, but the potential, because after this period of social isolation and distancing, which feels so inconsistent with what with humanity, right, is about gathering. That's gets us into the conversation about theater, because it's human nature to want to gather and have some kind of shared experience, shared joy, shared pain, shared just like, what does this even mean? I can't even process what this means. So we can get into that, talk about that a little bit on a big scale. And then if we have time and we still have energy, then we can talk about what an individual production, sort of how it works from a financial standpoint. I have 2 Post-it notes for myself. Don't touch your face and stop talking. So those are my 2 goals for the day. We'll see how far we get.
And I'll say that we will have a time sort of towards the last 30% or so of the session where we will open up questions from you guys. There's a couple of ways you can do it. You can digitally raise your hands, or you can write in the Q&A section. There's a chat. I would rather all the questions go through the Q&A section. And if you have any comments or so as we're talking, do you want to share with everyone, then do that in the chat section. Wonderful. Mr. Schrader.
Okay, cool. I'm going to jump in and out of share screen here too, but I'll go back to one. There we go. What I just said. So hopefully I'll stick to some sort of theme. I don't know. We'll find out. I am originally from Boston area, and I say my stage career sort of began and ended in the same year in 1971. Grade school show, and my assignment was to wear this Army uniform and present the colors. I did not at that moment catch the theater bug. I spent more time with this woman, Mrs. Crozier, who ran the ticket sales at the front of the auditorium and literally kept it in a cigar box, right? Like, she had cash in there and tickets in there. And I was like the kid who always wanted to understand how things worked. How does that work? Explain this to me. So the next year or so, I find myself in my first business venture with this letter where I can't even spell my own name correctly, yet I have this instinct for business where I'm saying, you soda vendor man have created this inadvertent problem, and you have created this litter situation, and I can help you with your problem. I'll collect the cans and flip tops from your soda shop if you'll pay me to do that. So I can't explain why my brain worked that way, but it's Earth Day, and in the 1970s, we were first considered about the ecology. So I'm like selling back to this guy, I can help you solve your problem. So, so my little brain always kind of thought like that, I guess. And relating to some of your other excellent MasterMiND series, I was listening to Chris Renshaw and to Orton Squire talk, and they, looking back in time, say, oh, this was an important thing to me, but you didn't know it was an important thing at the time. And particularly, I didn't know I wasn't allowed to do something or permitted to do it or whatever. You just write that letter and march down there and say, I'm going to solve your problem, right? You don't, and it's only through time that you think, oh, I shouldn't do that. Or, not me, I'm not the person who should do that, but why, right? Why? Let's test that theory. Maybe I am the person who's supposed to do it. So why shouldn't you start a theater company that's doing something no one else is doing? No, you should do that. Who's going to do it if it's not you, right? Who's going to do that?
There's a certain blessing of thinking you can do something that you probably cannot do, right?
Right. and that is sort of where I'm feeling very philosophical, having time to reflect, when we can't gather. But it is about, I was always, some people are fueled when someone says, this is impossible, you can't do it. What I think that really means, though, is you may think this is impossible, right? I don't want to actually be challenged to do something that I physically cannot do. That's defeating. What I do like is when someone will help me expand the realm of what I think is possible. That's interesting, right? Of course you can do this if you try, right? Sort of the trust fall exercise, or, outward bound. Like, who says you can't do this? Are you saying you can't do that? Who's putting this restriction on you? So it's good thinking through those times of when I didn't know something shouldn't be done or couldn't be done, or what was the reason. And yet it could be done, not because it was literally impossible, but just because no one had thought of it that way, or the situation hadn't presented itself, or we hadn't poked at that theory to say, is that assumption really true? And that has proven to be the key in a lot of situations, right? So my family moved from Massachusetts to Houston when I was in junior high school, which was just interesting to see, the way another part of the country worked. I had a really good high school there, as I had good fortune to be in good school districts as an elementary and junior high. And those teachers that did say, what about this? Let's go to the aquarium. Let's go to the Coca-Cola bottling factory and see how that works. You remember all that stuff because it's the first time someone said, there's this whole world out there, right? There's this whole other thing. And my high school in Friendswood, Texas, was renowned for doing musicals. So that was really, I would have to say, the first time I had any real comprehension of what it took, because of the number of people that were involved and sort of the community supporting and, hoping that it's good and wanting it to be good and supporting it and kind of having a window into that. I was in speech and debate, and at that point we didn't really talk to the drama people. I don't know why, but that was like a social rule. So, but that was my first, like, oh, that's interesting. That's kind of fun. I went to college in Waco, Texas, which was also interesting and formative in a lot of ways. Like, to be a fish out of water in a evangelical Christian school was interesting. I couldn't exactly explain why I went there, but I wanted to, and it was very interesting to see how other people that were from a different community than me thought and processed things. And interesting. I worked in Dallas. I got an accounting degree. I was a CPA right out of school. I worked in public accounting for 6 years, which was a fantastic education because it works almost like old school apprenticeship. You're going to sit next to someone who's going to review what you do and teach you how to do it. And you get to ask questions, which is really one of the things I like to do the most. How does this work? Or why does that work? Or is this important, right? And see how all the parts of a system come together. I did that for 6 years. I got to learn supervising people. I left that and went to one of my big clients was American Airlines, which I've always loved the airline industry, and that was fantastic. But the good news at that point was you could use your travel benefits to fly places. So I traveled a lot, and I went to New York, and a friend of mine had already moved to New York, and I thought, why am I not living here? Like, people, you come to Manhattan, you either fall in love with it or you don't. And I did. And I got a job at Viacom at the time. And right after that, in this sort of unexpected good things happened, a headhunter called me and said, Disney is looking for people in finance for this new theater group. Beauty and the Beast was on Broadway in 1994. Broadway was not at its full potential in the 90s. So the company was looking to expand on Beauty and the Beast. That was the first pancake. There were certainly things good about it, a learning experience. But there were multiple companies of beauty at that point, because the film was obviously an international box office success. So why can't we expand this? And I came in 1996. Lion King had not been formed as a theatrical idea. The movie was 1994. And the legend goes that because Beauty and the Beast worked on stage, Michael Eisner challenged the team to you should put Lion King on stage. But no one could quite imagine how that was possible, given that things that work in animation tend to be fantastical, right? And the thing that might make you want to watch an animated movie, like, I don't know, Finding Nemo or something below water, that's so fun for the animators to deal with, are impractical from a stage standpoint, or apparently. So I did get to witness a lot of the development process of The Lion King. And when it went to Minneapolis for its tryout, it was difficult, right? In retrospect, everyone would say, what a great idea. Why did, what was so difficult about that? But physically it was difficult. And from every department on the production side. And the first few shows, of course didn't run smoothly. It was very difficult and complex and a big learning curve. But it had already been announced that it was coming to Broadway in the newly restored New Amsterdam Theater. So that was all going to happen. So as a witness, as a person who looked at it from the accounting and the business standpoint, as a junior person, I got to ask a lot of questions and see a lot of process over something that turned out to be pretty exciting. It wasn't even really initially a box office smash, which is the way most of these things work, because the producer or the staff people working on it don't determine what's going to be a success. The public determines what's going to be a success. So it took a minute for people to get their heads around it, because the Disney brand at the time meant something you do with your kids. But Julie Taymor's artistry transcended that, so that it was something you do as a night of theater. And yes, you could bring people older than you or younger than you. But
it's interesting, right? Because that artistic shift between Beauty and the Beast. Beauty and the Beast is completely, classical. People are wearing costumes. It's sort of like it's not at all inventive. It's rather the old model done correctly, and with vamps here and there, and it sort of worked together. But the Lion King really reimagined sort of the possibilities of storytelling, of fantastical storytelling, in a way that was exciting, right? I mean, it really did what Lion King, the movie, did to animated movies. Lion King, the musical, did to stage storytelling.
Yes, Beauty, is from if we just looked at it as a production, it looks like The Sound of Music. It looks like a traditional musical, and Lion King kind of doesn't really look like. There's people in the aisles. What are you talking about, right? We're gonna have puppets in the show, which kind of, if you just read about it, or you're trying to imagine it's not going to work up front, you think puppets on Broadway, like, what's that? But they're so it's part of what works in the show's favor is that it isn't all language dependent, right? There's multiple languages in the show. It's not all just in English, and there's whole parts of it that no one's talking. And there's some of the most
storytelling,
parts, right? So yeah, we're gonna pull in all sorts of different experiences that she had. So for me to see that process, and honestly, not coming from the theater, because there really aren't finance people in the theaters, you know, historically, that I didn't know what could be done or what couldn't be done. So I just learned along with it. And part of what was interesting is most of the time, theater is focused on cost. Where am I going to get the money from? Either earned or contributed. And I need to focus on not spending money. I need to focus on trade-offs. And so that whole process had happened. But then, because it became a success and the demand for tickets was very strong, I started being asked questions by Peter Schneider, who was like whip smart, challenging me, saying, can you give me a report that shows the tickets we haven't sold? Oh, wait, okay. And I had to work with this Jerome Kane, super smart box office guy, to get Ticketmaster to write a report to get the information we wanted, because no one had ever asked the question.
No one had ever asked, right.
There was no need to look
at it. No one had that problem, the problem of success.
and that all turned into, you know, looking for not just per show, but by pattern, or why aren't the Tuesday nights selling? Why are they slower than Wednesday nights? Maybe we shouldn't have a Tuesday night anymore. Maybe we should do this, right? It turned into a whole series of what ifs, because while the production people were still trying to figure out how to run the show 8 times a week, the finance people and the producers were trying to figure out, what is this worth? How do I optimize this? And because it was a public company, our mission was to try to optimize it financially, right? And so my heater just came on. Can you hear that? I don't know why it's cold in there. Anyway, if it gets annoying, we'll turn it on. So then we had multiple companies of Beauty and the Beast, multiple companies of The Lion King, and then Aida, and eventually Mary Poppins, which was fantastic to get to work with Cameron McIntosh because he had tons of experience. So that he came at it from a different angle. It's super interesting. So I just got to learn a whole lot. And for 10 years, I worked on finance there, reporting the business to our office in Los Angeles at the film studio. And then the second 10 years that I was there, I was managing director for almost all of that, where I was responsible for the business functions, from human resources to finance to marketing to strategy, really kind of running that side of the business, which was super interesting to me, and tons of experience out of that as well. So that's what I did. And then I came to a time, because we had as many as 15 or 16 Broadway scale productions running in different places around the world. And I kind of looked up after having my head down for 20 years and was a little bit exhausted, because the theater business pulls you in, as you know.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
Stretching everything.
Understatement.
So I just had my head down, doing it. And part of it was, I wasn't feeling great. And my way to attack that is to do more. Like, I'm just going to get over this, right? I'm going to push through it. A very 1990s thing to do. And I couldn't figure it out. I could not figure out what was going on. And then I got passed from doctor to doctor, and I got passed to a rheumatologist who figured out after a period of time that I had this thing called Sjogren's syndrome. And that was like, what? I don't even know what that is. I had never heard of it before. I didn't know. And interestingly, medical science didn't really believe in rheumatological diseases, where kind of up until through medical science, doctors didn't believe that your cells would attack your own cells. It's just not going to happen, right? They'll attack invader cells. That's what your white blood cells are designed to do, but they won't attack your own tissue until someone figured out that they could and then tested it. And that's what all the rheumatological diseases are. Rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, where your body's white cells are inadvertently attacking something in you they're not supposed to be. triggers this whole thing. But until they didn't see it because they weren't looking for it, right? No one thought this could happen. So I figured out I have that, and I'm exhausted, and the only way out of it for me was to just stop doing what I was doing, which I really loved, but it wasn't smart for me to continue working, 14 hours a day in multiple time zones and whatever. So, okay, we're just going to make a change. So part of that, though, what was difficult to deal with and negative, but it got me into coming to Miami more, and it got me into speaking with you more, and it got me into finding ways to support organizations that I felt like I had something to share. And then eventually I worked on a branding project with the Sjogrens Foundation, and they asked me to be on the board. And that is the exact opposite of what you described our interaction is, because I go in there not knowing anything. I'm in a room of 30 physicians and research people, and I just sit there and absorb it all. Is there something they can tell me? What do I have to share? Right? My experience is irrelevant to someone who's trying to solve that kind of problem. So anyway, that's a long way around. I was in a very unique period in the theater business where we had multiple successes in a row. We had at one point 4 shows running on Broadway. I got to witness 10 different shows being developed and produced, which most people don't. The reason I would say my experience is interesting and also not interesting is there aren't very many corporate entities that are in the theater. There aren't very many people in the theater who have to, report to head office in Los Angeles.
Right.
The way the company was organized, we had the good fortune to have a lot of people on staff. So we had expert marketing people on staff and lawyers and a labor relations person on staff, which that's just not the way theater's organized for the most part. It's more in a shared services model where you have a few people who are really expert in something and everyone goes to them. So my experience is sort of relevant and interesting, but also not relevant, to
right, because there's nothing that looks like that machine, right? Everything else is sort of like producer led, and you hire per project, etc. But it's more. It looks more like what Disney is. It's a film company. It looks more like a studio.
Yes.
But there are I think some companies in Europe and in Latin America that sort of taking that model of being almost a monopoly of big branded music, etc. But I want us to focus. You really created a wonderful presentation that I want us to sort of like get into, because there's just a lot of great things to learn about the business of theater and how it developed, and I think let's take a look at that. Yeah.
So part of what really got me interested in working for the company was that in 1994, the Walt Disney Company stepped up and leased the then derelict New Amsterdam Theater, which was built in 1903, is absolutely glorious architecture and just a beautiful place for theater. But that history was an element in all of this for me. If we think about what sort of the center of the theater business is now and Times Square, what did it look like in 1900? Well, in 1896, then Longacre Square is dirt, right? There are theaters here, but there's dirt in the streets, horse-drawn carriages, trolley cars running up and down the street. It doesn't look at anything like what it looks like now, just 100 years ago. So how did it get from there to the thing that we know today? This is my 5 minutes of 100 years of history, and I'm certain that I have selected titles in here that other people will say, no, you forgot this. But in general, we know theater has been there with humanity. People have always wanted to gather and hear a good storyteller and see a good show and be transported, or sometimes it's just pure entertainment, and sometimes it's to be challenged, right? To see something. Not everyone thinks waiting for Godot is pure entertainment, right? It's partly there to challenge how you think, what you think.
By the way, it had its American premiere here in Miami at the Coconut Grove Playhouse in, I think, 1956 or so.
Interesting.
Just as an interesting trivia.
Yeah. And that there's been drama, right? The first playhouse in New York, a building built for plays, is from 1790s, probably, the Park Theater. And the Walnut Street in Philadelphia is the oldest building continuously operated as a theater, 1809. So we're talking colonial times plus. But while there's drama, there's music in shows, but the notion of a musical.
And there's melodrama, right? Melodrama was sort of like the hit of the day during the late 19th century, right? The melodrama plays. Yeah.
And we have vaudeville, revues, follies, showgirls. Like, that was pushing the technology of the day to have super fancy costumes and to have things like, even, people doing tricks, a little bit of comedy, stuff that would draw an audience in. That's going on in the 1890s and 1930s, up through the 1930s. Broadway, the word that we think of as synonymous with theater now, well, we just saw what became Times Square wasn't Times Square in 1900, right? The population was further downtown in New York, and theaters were all over the place downtown. So really, post-Civil War, Union Square to Madison Square is kind of the center of life in New York City. And then when we get closer to 1900, we're moving up toward Herald Square. And there was a whole theater district around Herald Square. The Schuberts, the first theater I think they bought was the Herald Square Theater. The New York Times moved to a new building in Longacre Square in 1904, and that's when it was renamed Times Square. And there were a couple of theaters. The New Amsterdam was built at that point, 1903. People were figuring out the population wanted to move north, and we're going to build the theaters north and see where people come to. The leaders in the theater business at that point, Claw and Erlanger, two partners, formed the Syndicate because they wanted to control as much as they could the venues and the talent. That's what they were, talent bookers. And they would then, the notion of let's take this on the road, let's go out and tour. They were the first big company that was touring talent around the country. The Schubert brothers, three of them, come into the picture as immigrants into the United States. And they challenge the Syndicate and say, wait, why is there only one of these? We're going to form one and take over the theater business. And both buying theaters and managing theaters. By the 1920s, they are managing, either directly or through management agreements, or booking 1,000 theaters across the United States. So they completely dominate this business. And the good part is that what's going on in American society at that point is you have like Henry Ford rolling his first Model T off the assembly line in 1908. So it isn't like he invented everything about it, but what he did was rationalize it so it could be mass produced. And that's rationalization process is part of what's going on. We're not going to just be one theater now, we're going to make it into an industry, is what's happening. To the point where they kind of overstepped and needed to be trust busted. They were so in control of it. So you get the labor pushing back and forming equity to try to create some sort of balance here in 1919. If you're going to have all these actors and performers, there need to be some boundaries around that, right? Then we get in 1927 Showboat, which most people think is sort of the first storytelling musical thing that we think of as a modern musical. But we also have a late 1890s, Thomas Edison is inventing the moving picture. So we have photography, but now he's going to think about a way to capture something on film and at first show it to you on those flip, 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 so that you literally see the picture moving, but then he's going to move toward film so that it could be projected on a screen. That arguably, you know, tips off this huge industry at that moment of creating motion pictures, which should have probably, it was a little bit like the shift from physical seeing a movie in a cinema to streaming it in your home. It's much more convenient and much cheaper. It costs a nickel, you know, at some point to go see a film. And so even though they were expensive to produce, they were much cheaper to distribute than all the labor that's always involved in theater. So that sort of begins this tension between New York theater world and Hollywood, pulling back and forth, pulling for talent, developing movie palaces all over the country, some of which were built out of theaters. And in some cases, the movie palaces were built in places and now they're back to stage theaters.
Which is a good segue. The Colony Theater was built in 1935 by Paramount Studios. And for 20 some years, it worked mainly as a movie theater until, again, they were vertically integrated. The industry was vertically integrated until the 1950s, where they were, again, forced to break the monopolies, and then distributors needed to be a different company than the theaters. They projected the movie in different companies than the studios that produce them. So that is why then afterwards, the Colony ended up being a performing theater.
And that's a beautiful gem of a theater that's there, and they're all over the country. Some of them, you know, most of them haven't been rescued, and certainly not turned back into places for live entertainment. But then we get the Depression coming in, which actually kind of helped the Hollywood industry because people wanted some sort of relief from it and wanted some transporting experience. And so Hollywood really pushed on the gas hard during that time period, but theater has always been with us and continues to evolve. So then you get Anything Goes, kind of a fun transporting show, and you get Porgy and Bess, a storytelling show, opera, that people had never really seen anything like that before on stage, right? So we're expanding what's possible. Then in 1943, you get Rodgers and Hammerstein, Oklahoma, which is, that was one of the shows done in my high school days. So it's one of those that's like, I know it, I'm so familiar with it, but it's interesting to see, yet it can be reinvented, still relevant all this time later. When you see a production of it now, oh, it's still, it's what I think of when I saw The Cubans, right? Like, I don't know, I'm not Cuban, what am I gonna see? On some part of your brain is saying, how can I relate to this? No, you feel part of that family, it's your family, right? So when the characters in Oklahoma are such classic characters that when you see it, you know who those people are. On the Town, then you get Annie Get Your Gun, which we say is a bit transgressive because it has a female lead in it now in 1946. Kind of groundbreaking. South Pacific Transportive.
And mixed, it also has, groundbreaking, it has a mixed race couple, right? First time ever on stage.
And closer to the subject matter they're describing, right? Things would go from front page to stage quickly,
right,
in those time periods. So that gets us through the 40s. Then we get to The King and I in 1951. West Side Story, now a big musical being told transgressively partly through ballet, difficult to produce and cast, but we recognize that as a classic now and being done on Broadway in a yet more transgressive way. And a major motion picture being done, you learn Steven Spielberg is obsessed with the show, right? That's why he wanted to produce it. When you read why he wanted to do it, because it's such a classic tale told for a different audience, but it comes from 1957. The Sound of Music, Gypsy, and then we get to Fiddler, 1964, which was the longest running show in history. It was so successful. Shows didn't tend to run as long, but a wildly successful show. but at the start of the 60s, then 60s is kind of counterculture, so you get
But
the
it's
response.
right, but it's interesting that you went out with Fiddler on the Roof, which is sort of like the best book. It's sort of like a perfect book musical. So like by that time, Broadway figured out the absolute best equation to create book musicals. I mean, all of them sound of music, but they sort of, and then artistically, they just go counterculture.
Right.
So,
I'm going to break all those rules and see if I can do
yes.
something at the other side, right? And these scores are largely in the classic mold, right? But now, because what's going on in culture is Woodstock, right? I'm going to come up with a stage version of that in Hair, in rock music, in Jesus Christ Superstar, and stories about the theater too, in Company and A Chorus Line, which is interesting that subject matter people wanted to view in to see what was going on. Then you get to Annie in 1977, which is a musical in the classic mold, but one where with a young protagonist, and maybe the idea was to make the audience bigger, right? I'm bringing in different kinds of people to each of these different shows. Maybe I could make a show that you would bring your family to, which
now we take for granted, but
someone had to have that idea.
But it's interesting. So in this list, we have Hair and we have A Chorus Line, two shows that were developed at the Public Theater.
Yes.
Right? This is the first time that sort of off-Broadway is starting, not only to exist as a real thing, but it's also starting to feed to Broadway.
Yes, that something could be such a success when it's being subversive that it actually crossed that boundary into popular.
Right.
Interesting. In the 1970s, if we can put our heads back there for a minute, the economy was difficult and the country felt sort of polluted, and people were just focusing on, for the first time on ecology. And there was this unrest from the 60s that moved into a sort of malaise in the 70s. And when you go back and watch, Welcome Back, Kotter or something, the subways were totally graffitied. It didn't feel safe in the city, and things lacked a certain energy. Urban cores, people were moving further to the suburbs for safety and good schools, and the urban decay is setting in. And so in the 1970s, it was not a great time for what we think of now as Broadway. One of the things that's helped turn that around is success in London of a series of shows, not just one show, but of Cats and Les Mis and Phantom and then Miss Saigon, that were wildly successful in London. And Andrew Lloyd Webber and Cameron Mackintosh brought them to the United States, and they were equally successful. So that helped bring more product and a different kind of audience. A transfer is interesting, because if we're just opening, we'll say we're opening Hair at the Public, right? And it becomes successful and I'm selling tickets, I know one thing before I move it. Versus if it had just opened cold on Broadway, I don't really know. I don't have that audience response yet, right? But in these shows, they already knew that there was an audience for this because they were successful in London. So when they brought them to New York, there was already pre-existing interest and demand and anticipation for them. And they knew they could deliver it because they'd already produced the show. And as if it were in London at that point, it would be like it was on another planet, right? So those help.
It's interesting because, you look at it artistically, and all those shows of the 1980s really don't have much artistic merit today, right? Like we look at them and we're like, wow, Cats and Phantom and The Miz and Miss Saigon, and they, in a way, kind of didn't age well in the way that, you look at a couple of decades, Oklahoma or South Pacific still sort of like hold a certain artistic integrity that I feel that like the big flashy 1980s musicals just don't anymore.
Yeah, I don't know. We see them differently because we own Oklahoma, right? Like that. It's an American story.
But even Hair, right? No, I understand what you say. That's a British invasion, but still, those were like fast food musicals. You know what I mean? Like they had great melodies there, and Andrew Lloyd Webber, I think, did some extraordinary work. But I think that, it's really hard to try to artistically rescue Cats, or Phantom, or you know what I mean?
Yeah, Phantom's still running on Broadway. right? So,
Listen,
so
I
so
mean,
there's something people see that's still relevant. And in its day, I would say each of those three was pushing the technology
the
hard. It was
technology for sure. There were
available
big
today,
flashes.
right?
That's Aristoteles. You know
So no
that.
one had ever seen anything like that. In the scenes
No.
in Phantom that, there's no stage floor and people are falling into an abyss that no one had ever seen that. No one had done that.
Right. I mean, you think of Phantom, you think of the falling chandelier, you think of Miss Saigon, you think of the helicopter. Like there was a big showy musicals.
Yes, I'm going
Right.
to get value out of that, right? I'm going to see something. And then they did figure out how to take those on tour as well,
Right.
which, was a bold step to provide um, a product, so to speak, into more or less a vacuum. There was not a strong domestic touring business at that point, I understand. So, but what they did is they showed it could be commercial. And that is what got other people interested at the same time, because the Walt Disney Company's animation studio was being revived. That team looked to Broadway composers like Alan Menken and Howard Ashman. Can you come help us tell those kinds of stories, not on stage but on film? So that happening in parallel with development of these British invasion musicals kind of came together to maybe, if Beauty and the Beast is very successful in 1991, resetting the clock, so to speak, as for people to want to see animated movies, why can't you do it on stage is sort of the question. And that sort of a group of people got together within the company to do it on stage, and pulling on some, people who were experienced on stage. They actually kind of pulled it off. But that was the first little itch to say, like, is there a real business here? Because if, as the Walt Disney Company, we think there's an audience there, we're going to go try to develop that, turn it into a company.
Right.
But again, the counter programming is, but at the same time, you have Rent coming out of
theater
nowhere,
workshop, right?
super transgressive, right? Characters no one's ever seen on Broadway before, very down and dirty. And that's sort of, to me, what helped Broadway get to the next place. Is it's not just one thing, now it's going to be 5 things, right? It's not the place you go because they have the best vanilla bean ice cream in the world. They have the best ice cream, period. So if you love pistachio and someone else likes, gluten-free, raspberry, whatever, it's the marketplace you come to. And that's what makes theater goers. I go for different reasons. I go for fun. I go because someone's in town. And that's sort of this marketplace idea gets expanded here. And then The Lion King comes into that arena that's kind of primed already in a way, maybe not overtly. People were suspect of it. But once it hit and people said, oh, they really are delivering, that is an experience you will remember, then it caught fire, right? And it actually worked. We were, at the time, the top ticket price was $75. And there was a feeling that we were not going to, the Walt Disney Company's group was not going to break that rule. We didn't want to attract the attention of being the highest priced thing. And we did work some on ticket prices at the time, pushing the envelope a bit, because as we said, the question Peter asked me is, why are you determining what the ticket price is? We should let the customer determine what the ticket price is.
And that's interesting. And so as we continue now, I think that at this time, we really need to sort of pivot a little bit more on to talking about the actual business of theater.
Great.
But you're now bringing a really interesting subject matter, which is, ticketing price. Suddenly, a whole Pandora box open of possibilities, right? Especially with the producers of which is,
they had an advantage because they had big stars in the show, and the perception from history is that stars don't last forever in a show. They might do 9 months or 12 months, and so that adds heat to the demand. The show is, transgressive and fun and crazy and delivers and super theatrical, but they had Nathan Lane, and that sold tickets, and that let them raise the roof, and then we sort of crept up behind them to raise the ticket price, and we could tell if we raised the price a little bit, which this seems like, such a
so logical today, right?
Totally, we wouldn't worry about it now, but at the time, no one had ever done that. The other thing that's interesting about these titles is, in retrospect, we go, oh yeah, I would have done that. But at the time, nobody thought Beauty and the Beast was going to work. The team on it thought it was going to work, right? But the marketplace didn't know. Nobody thought, other than the team working on it, that Rent would be this gigantic hit that would sort of change our perception of musical theater. These things tend to come out of nowhere. They tend to surprise people. We were offered to take an investment in Wicked, and I'll say I read it and I thought, I don't get it. I'm not the audience for it, so I have to keep that in mind as I'm reading it. But I thought, I don't understand it. And it didn't have a great first 9 months. It was not an instantaneous success. It had to find its audience, and the producers had to figure out how to speak to that audience, right? That they, to make it actually work. So that's what actually creates what this is today, right? This vibrant public marketplace where there's lots of theater going on, and it doesn't just mean one thing. It means I'm going to go there and I'll find something that I would see, right? Which of these things should I see? Because any of them might work for me. So we're going to jump to how big is this sort of business? We don't tend to, because most theater is local, there are associations that speak for parts of the theater business, but there isn't really one Uber group that represents all of theater in the US. So if we just think about Broadway, where we have the League, what Broadway literally is these days is about 40 buildings that qualify, that have more than 500 seats and that are in a specific area plus Lincoln Center. So it's a designation, right? And if we look across this period from the 80s that were not the strongest to what we think of as sort of last season was spectacular, box office revenue goes seven times as much, from $200 million to $1.8 billion last year. Just Broadway.
Just those 40 buildings. Unbelievable. And
attendance, which is utilization of seats, right? I have 8 shows a week. I have so many seats. In 1984, we weren't having as many weeks, and we weren't having as many seats in those weeks filled. But the attendance doubles, more than doubles, from 7 million to almost 15 million a year. And because there's so much demand, average ticket price goes to
the roof,
$28 to $123. Part of that is very hit driven, because we know, we mentioned producers, like they were able to extract a high ticket price. Hamilton, obviously, with intense demand on a relatively small number of seats, pushed the ticket price up. But all of these factors working together created a really healthy situation. Broadway shows on tour, it used to be, back in the day, before there was a lot of sort of production value, that you could run a show in New York and then you would take it on the road and make more money.
Right.
Nowadays, a Broadway show that most of them have stuff, lighting, scenic, lots of costumes, they have production value. To take a show on tour is actually more expensive.
Sure.
You have to have all the logistics to travel it. You have to provide travel, housing, and per diem to the entire cast. You have to get them from place to place. So the economics are always a little bit more challenging from a Broadway touring standpoint. You have to load in and load out. You can't just market it, to one group of people. You're relying on local people in every market to sell it. So it's got different economics, but curiously, if we think that Broadway tours could be presented in 20 cities around the US and Canada, over that same time frame from 85 to 2019, box office skyrockets in parallel with Broadway in New York, from 200 million to 1.6 billion. Attendance goes from a higher than New York 8 million in all these cities to a higher than New York 18 million. And the average ticket price also goes up, right? Which again, this is partly skewed by the Lion Kings and the Hamiltons and the producers of the world, but people are seeing there's great value, so they're willing to pay this. Add those together in a combined 2018-19 season, you get $3.5 billion being paid for theater tickets and 30 million people seeing a Broadway show in New York or on tour. It's a big industry.
Which is about 10% of America.
Right?
10% of America, that's huge.
It's huge.
And that doesn't even count what you'll talk about next.
Right. That's just what we think of as Broadway.
Right.
At the top level, right? London is a gigantic theater market too, and their organization is 48 member theaters and 25 other organizations. They're $1 billion in box office in 2018, 15 million attendance, which their population is 1/5 the size of the United States, right?
So 30% of them are going to a theater.
Huge, and a pretty healthy average ticket price there. UK in general theater, because we also think of sort of festival theater and theaters in the major cities all around the country, is another 165 venues and 630 million box office, 18 million people, a heavy interest in theater going, right? So it's 1.6 billion just in the UK alone. And Broadway shows, level shows are produced in Germany and Japan and in Canada and Toronto, in Holland, in Australia, and in some cities in Latin America, Mexico City and Sao Paulo, that also have their own local version of theater in local language, locally developed, or licensed versions.
And that was my entire past life in Venezuela. I was directing, producing, and translating big musicals, etc. So I was paying you my royalties.
Thank you. So duly noted. It's a very large ecosystem. But come back to the United States, right, where you have Broadway and touring as the sort of top level thing, but off Broadway, which kind of came into existence as a thing in the 1950s, is 60 theaters that are between 100 and 500 seats. And off-Broadway theater, which came into existence as a thing in the 60s, is more thought of as experimental theater, where we're really going to do some challenging, interesting stuff at a 100-seat or smaller theater. And there's a group now, the League of Independent Theater, across the city that has 200 theater venues that are or production companies that are members of it. So that's a pretty big business, and it reaches into all the neighborhoods of New York City. It's mostly not Manhattan. It's Brooklyn and Queens, where people live. They want theater. Across the country, sort of the touring equivalent, more or less, is the Lords Resident Theaters. Has 75 active companies that are members in it. They have to, as you know, reach a level. They have to qualify. Right. They have to have 12 weeks of performances. They have to recognize equity. They have to recognize the directors and the USA. They have to be a professional level in order to belong to the organization. TCG is the big umbrella for every theater company, community theaters and college theaters, 700 theaters. And I don't know what 3 states lack a TCG member, but they should get busy.
And we're Miami Drama is a member of TCG. We actually had the TCG conference in Miami last summer. We were lucky enough, TCG pointed us to chair the conference here locally. So we got a chance to see 1,000 people from those 700 theaters, spending most of the time at the Martini Bar or at the swimming pool at the Hilton. So it was really...
Who doesn't want to go to Miami? Everybody wants to go to Miami. And the scale, I had to look around actually to find this. Interestingly, we said Broadway producers are mostly independent businessmen or investors. So it's unusual that through an honor system years ago, they all agreed to publish their grosses. But normally we wouldn't have that level of access to understand that data for private businesses. The organizations we're describing here collect box office information from their members, and U.S. nonprofit theaters, so the not Broadway part, right?
That's awesome.
The Miami New Dramas of the world, 1.4 billion a year in ticket sales in 2018-19. And in addition, because they need to be subsidized, because you can't sell enough tickets to cover your costs, 1.3 billion in contributed revenue to nonprofit theaters across the country. That is a significant amount of money that's out there to support art, support gathering. 39,000, 40,000 performances in non-for-profit theater, and an average ticket price of $41, which, all things considered, is a number. It's a healthy number. So the domestic business is almost a $5 billion business, plus contributed revenue. And 70 million theater tickets sold every year is a significant business. We tend to think of it as very local, or we look at the Broadway numbers because they're disclosed, but the rest of this information isn't often discussed, but it's quite large. And relatively speaking, I think domestic cinema ticket sales, many more venues at a much lower ticket prices, about 11 billion last year.
Right, so we're half
of that. That's pretty
huge.
Significant at a $41 instead of at a, or
right.
Even higher, $41.
Now that the government gave a couple of $1 trillion in aid, like the trillion just like screwed our understanding of money. So now like 2 billion seems like nothing, but it's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money. It's a lot, and a lot of 70 million people showing up, but we know thousands of people delivering that, whether they are writers or creative designers or ushers or cast members or orchestra, or what, that's a lot of jobs underlying that. So we talked yesterday a little bit to say, you know, the good news is the theater business was very vibrant, and it's unfortunate that at such a time of success, we're forced into this situation of uncertainty and don't gather, right? But I would say, as a sign of hope, we don't know when we're going to get the green light, but all these fundamental things still exist. The buildings are still there. The know-how is still there. People will want to see theater. I think, you know, hopefully people are writing about what they're thinking in this experience, and there'll be an explosion of art and creativity after this comes through. But the engine is ready to go, right? All the elements to restart or build something new. So that's this sort of mega scale, why, you know, it is important. We should be paying attention. It's vital.
You gave us history and understanding of the size of what the theater industry in all of its forms are. So now let's go.
Let's go way back down.
Let's go back in, right, to
the other level,
the DNA, right?
How does one show work? And we know that is could be an extended process or an iterative process of coming up with an idea. Maybe it's written in words, maybe it's words and music. In a commercial-ish production, or you as producer decides you want to do it, you might need to acquire rights, which we didn't really talk about, but one of the formational things that was going on in that sort of 1900 to 1910 period, in addition to sorting out labor versus producer, the mechanisms by which copyrights by works are protected so that someone can make a living as a writer, those mechanisms form the model by which.
The same way that the union for actors formed, right? It was at the same time that sort of the union for composers and musicians sort of.
Correct. And at that point, it was a little easier to conceive of how to control it because everything is on paper and ink. I don't have recorded music when this stuff is first forming. I don't have film. So it was timely that the foundational elements kind of all came into formation and everyone agreed this is the way forward before they were then tested. But somehow producer has to get the money to do the show, whether it's from a season budget that's going to be supported by earned and contributed revenue, or someone's going to give the money. I got to get the team who's actually going to do it, envision what's going to happen, make a bunch of choices about it. And I got to find the people who can do it, which there's a huge talent pool out there, but when you can see what the demands of a role are going to be, matching that up is an art. Who's going to bring forth what I'm imagining in my head? All the physical stuff, which I'm, again, shorthanding lots of, there's lighting and sound, there's all kinds of elements of how I'm going to deliver this. Then maybe I can decide when this is all going to happen and book a theater and start to put tickets on sale. Rehearse, bring in your crew, bring in your orchestra before I get to performances. So this could take, 6 months of all that would be incredibly fast. It's probably years, right? Before that happens. And where the finance part comes in is as you're going along making decisions here, the accounting goes back to sort of early days of trade. If I'm going to be growing wheat and selling it to you, and you're going to grow grapes and make wine and sell it to me, I need some way to keep track of that. And so accounting goes back to those, early days of trade. And what it is to me, my first accounting teacher in college, Helen Miller, was the first person to tell me that it was a language. Like music is a language, accounting is just a description of activity, but it's in numbers. It's not words, it's just the same, what did I bring in, what did I spend, and a story written in numbers. And so a good set of financial statements should tell a story. It should not have a lot of distracting, immaterial, side notes and whatever in it. It should just lead me right through what the story is. And so as you're making decisions, you want to understand what the implications of those decisions would be. And to me, it layers across in 3 chunks, 3 categories. First, you got to have a plan. So you would look at a work and think, I could do this. I have the capacity to do this. I could spend what it takes. If someone approached you, to do a show with a cast of 175 people in it, that would probably be outside what you think your capacity would be. It would break the model. But you got to have some kind of plan up front so that I know I can afford this much for scenic, but if I spend everything on scenic, then I can't spend as much as I want on costumes. And almost all of a budget is going to be really on labor, time, money, and you have to have a rehearsal process in order to deliver the product. So when you start saying, if I only have $500,000 to produce this, I have to start by spreading that money across all these different topics. I can't start on day one and decide I'm just going to spend as I go along. I need a plan. Then once you're spending money, the accounting starts telling you how it's the odometer, right? It's telling you what you've spent versus what you still need to allocate. And if you're really successful and things tend to go well, then you can worry about the how do I sell every seat part, the sort of financial analysis part, but they're distinct chapters as we're going through this process. And I always say, we talked a little bit about it yesterday, there's this sort of resistance between art and money. It's natural, right? Because art's about creative freedom and, don't tell me I can't do this because of course I can do that. And yet, as you're making decisions, if you're going along, you kind of want to know what the implications of those things are. So in a perfect world, just as you would assembling the team to do the show, you want everyone to bring their best, and you want there to be a clear goal of what you're trying to get done. And you want that all those parts to add up to be bigger than the parts, right? I want it all to converge just at the right moment so that it takes me to some other level. And as a person who is supporting that function, I want to know what you're doing. I want to be very aware of steps you're taking and as you're going through the process, but I want to make sure that you're informed. Hey, this came in more expensive than we thought. Oh my gosh, a process is taking longer than you thought. What does that mean in money? Have I now spent the money I thought I was going to spend on this? Where am I going to get the extra money from? You need that. There's the activity sheet, the call sheet of what's happening in reality, but you need what does this mean to me in money terms at the same time? Because what my goal, or the finance person in the room, the accounting person in the room, is to keep you out of trouble and to make sure that you don't build something that cannot recoup. Don't get me in so deep, because I love my show so much. I'm going to spend more time and more money than I can sell in tickets. It goes back to where I started, which is I don't want to be tasked to do something that is literally impossible, that I cannot make money, or I can't hit my budget because I know part of it's going to be subsidized and I have to earn part of it. I don't want that task, because that's defeating, to be sold into something where you can't win. But what I want is to understand what the options might be, because then I can make decisions. And I can say, I know you're telling me this, but I'm still going to spend this money because it's the right thing to do. But I know I'm doing it, right? Not I'm doing it and no one told me, which is not that's an impossible situation. Is I didn't know that the implication of this choice was that. oh, right, I want that running dialogue. So shall we dive into one financial model?
I think it's important just to see an example of what that looks like.
And this is, again, as that timeline was, smashing a lot of complicated stuff into an oversimplified version. But imagine as we're spending money, red numbers, money going out, I'm spending money along, I have a plan. I've now spent $1 million on my show, which by not-for-profit standards would be huge, as big as it gets.
Right.
And I have 8 weeks of production to earn it back. So I've smoothed out what the ticket revenue would be here, but we know in reality, you're not going to start out at 100%. So I've made some assumptions in here, but your operating costs are you've got, in addition to what you spent to get to this place, now I have to pay everybody to actually do the show. So the most I could make in any week is some number. And that's what's going to earn back or recoup the $1 million I started out with. And in this scenario, I don't get to a modest profit, $120,000 in this example, until that last week. So if I'm up here and I'm deciding that I would like to spend an extra $50,000 on lighting equipment, it means I can only get to 70. And in these 20 weeks where maybe something great would happen, but in all likelihood, something unforeseen that is a drag might happen too, is it doesn't give me much room to get out of this box, which is why you get the notion of a contingency fund or a reserve fund up in here. I'm going to have $50,000 because I know something's going to come up that I'm going to want to change costumes, or I'm going to want to do something in here, right? But it is a box.
But I just want to make sure this really is sort of more of a for-profit model. I think that in the non-profit theater where we live in, we don't have the necessity of sort of have to break even, because then we have donations, et cetera, et cetera. So we have different freedom, but I just want to point out how extremely dangerous and perilous is this situation sort of for a commercial producers. Commercial producers, you have to, before anything, you capitalize a ton of money, and then you still have to pay all your running costs, and there is no guarantee that your revenue would even cover your running costs. So it's really an extremely dangerous and complicated situation for people trying to make money doing theater, right?
It's exciting from that standpoint, right? It's kind of dangerous because it is a little unlikely, and the odds would tell you that most commercial productions are lucky to get to recoupment, right? Not to actually earn a profit. If someone's going to give you $1 million, they're expecting they're going to get their $1 million back plus some, right?
Yes. So how long did it take, for example, for Lion King to recoup?
I'm going to say a little over a year, which as I recall, that disclosure, because it's a public company, the company was always sensitive about putting financial information out other than what box office information. But Variety would always call and ask everybody, hey, when did you get to recoupment? Because A, we should have cake. If you get to recoupment, we should have some cake. But then you'd start to apportion how you're paying either royalties to the creators or profits. And the Walt Disney Company, because it was a public company, was sensitive about disclosing that information. But give or take a year, which is for a big musical, that is long. Right. But it was a gamble to say, no, we need to spend X amount of money to get to this place. So
right. But I just also want to give the idea of how complicated, what is, the percentage of Broadway shows that open in a year that actually recoup?
For including plays and musicals, still about 35 shows open in a given year. Out of 40 buildings, right, there still are 10
because some of them are
shows, which were never in question. And at the Lort end, when you have Roundabout, they're doing multiple shows with limited runs, more like you. So the notion that a show runs for a defined period of time doesn't necessarily mean failure. Included in the numbers. It could mean that they delivered exactly what they were trying to do. But the old world used to be, you wouldn't design a show's budget so it couldn't recoup at something like 80% in 40 weeks. That has moved around a little bit. but we know, I mean, imagine what time it took to get to the place of reaching that decision and having people say, I got it, I understand what you're after, and we would do this. Lots of time to get to that place, and imagining what's going to happen over the next 40 weeks. At this point, like, I don't remember if it's Wednesday or Thursday, so I can't talk to you about what's going to happen 40 weeks from now. All sorts of stuff's going to happen. So you have to build a model knowing that that's not what's going to happen, right? The old saying is all models are wrong, but some are useful, that it's just directional. But something like 70% never reach recoupment. They get partly there, but they don't reach recoupment, which
70%, it's a huge number.
Huge number. And that may be, that's probably 5 years anecdotally old. I don't know what the current number would be, but in a commercial world, money would not be attracted to that, right? If something like 50% of small businesses fail over time, but people are doing it out of love and money, and they want to start their small business. Who would say, I'm going to spend all this time and energy and risk $1 million to do something that could only exist for 8 weeks, right? I almost never have the chance to make it great. If you were opening a restaurant or something, that would be 8 weeks would go by in a flash, and then you hope that you could run for a really long time, right? Or creating a product that could sit on a shelf. I don't need to do it in 8 weeks. I could deliver that product whenever. So this model has a lot of constraints in it and a lot of difficulty. And I think that is both scary, but also the reason people get hooked on it is because it's a puzzle to be solved and it's tricky to solve it.
Okay. So I think this is the last slide in your presentation. Am I right?
You are correct.
Okay, so it's interesting. So we've spoken about a lot today. I mean, this class, in a way, it's a little different than others because when we're talking about like playwriting, we can actually sort of like do exercise of playwriting, and people can. But in the business of theater, it's a hard thing to try to put into practice. So you really gave us an extraordinarily wonderful understanding of how theater came about, how the commercial aspect of theater. How did the commercial aspect of theater came about? How did it develop in the U.S. and where are we now, right? So we're soon going to start the question, the Q&A section, but where we're at now was a different question 3 months ago, 2 months ago than it is today.
For sure.
So, before we sort of open this Q&A section, I want to get a little bit in your brain into how you are seeing the future of the theater field under these new circumstances.
Well, I think that, people are really adaptable. People have responded, largely responsibly when someone tells you, educates you, in this situation, this is what you should do. As I said, the instruction to isolate yourself and distance yourself runs so counter to what you would do in a crisis. Right,
because 9/11, what happened in 9/11? We all wanted to be together.
Absolutely. Whether that was, put my loved ones around me or people that are important to me, or let's just go out to a bar, go to a restaurant and be free. Right, I want to experience my freedom. I want to be out and about. I want to connect with people. I don't want to be fearful. And that when something's an event, I can experience the fear and then get over it. So I kind of go back to normal. In this situation, because it's dragged out, and we also have to remember that, we're 320 million people in 50 different metropolises. So what we're experiencing in New York isn't the same thing you're experiencing. Sure. It's not the same thing someone is experiencing in Tacoma. And yet we lashed our fate together as a nation. And so some things we want to face as a nation, but we're actually still dealing with it locally. So I am waxing philosophical about the subject, but I think that when you look at theater over a very long period of time, or over 1,000, over 100 years, people want to gather. I want someone like you to tell me a story. Bless you. I want you to get me to that place where I put my phone away and I don't react to every distraction that's coming at me and everything everybody else wants me to do. And I put myself in the situation where I'm just going to listen, right? I love that circumstance. You and I share that love for that moment in the theater when it gets quiet and most people have put their phone away and most people are ready, right? Something's going to happen. And right before the curtain goes up is that moment. Anything can happen.
Anything can happen.
I don't know what you're going to show me, right? But I'm receptive to you.
Right.
So I think that is human nature. And once someone says, it's okay, you can go now, I think people will rush to live experiences, right? That you would have thought, we were sort of told that the virtual experience is going to supplant the gathered experience, that there's so much content you can watch on your iPad. And a lot of it is extremely high quality, great storytelling, right? That you're going to do that instead of. But the trends would tell us that it's in addition to, it's, or trade-offs. It's not, people are adaptable, and yes, I can watch stuff on my iPad and I can get into that sort of storytelling, but it is not the same thing.
It is not, no.
So no matter how much someone tries to solve virtual reality to come up with a new experience that feels like it's a conversation, theater is a conversation. It's an exchange of energy. It's this mode where you allow yourself to be led, right? I'm taking fear out of the equation. I don't know what's going to happen. Right. You're going to show me something. And if I'm lucky, I'll be, entertained. If I'm really lucky, you're going to get me to think differently about something, which you, my friend, are habitual about. But I think about the bridge of St. Louis Ray, right? That is so spooky that's what you were doing recently. Right. And it speaks to what's going on in the world and the country and our communities is big because you're reading these numbers every day. What does this trend mean? I don't know. But then it's all very local. It's about someone, what am I supposed to be doing? Or someone I know is affected, and what does that mean? Or one of my neighbors who's in the medical field is trudging out every day to go into a completely chaotic situation where in some cases they're left feeling kind of helpless, right? They can't do their job necessarily, right? There's all this stuff going on. And who says this person's number came up and that person's didn't? There's a randomness to what's going on when you read individual stories about someone who thought it was safe to go on a cruise and they didn't know, and then they were dramatically affected by this. And that's what was playing out in the Colony Theater and making me think about that. And it was so poignant, so interesting, but the way you got it was not by telling me that's what it was, right? I didn't know that's what was going to happen. So me being susceptible to it, and you see it leaves you thinking, right? I'm still thinking about it. Months later, I'm thinking about what I saw. And the trick of the whole show was I never actually saw what I thought I was going to see.
Right, exactly.
So it leaves you with this conundrum to talk about, expanding the realm of the possible, something I don't think about most of the time. We don't think about how interconnected we are. We don't think about, now we're saying, thank goodness for the grocery store clerks and the people stacking stuff and the people who are still driving the subway cars and whatever. Let's celebrate all them. But they're there all the time making the whole thing work, right?
And underpaid, and most of the time without insurance, etc. But that's a whole other.
Right, we're kind of as a society taking advantage of people, or not giving them their due. But boy, when this happens, you realize they're important. You realize it's easy for me to isolate, but what that really means is the Amazon guy's still going to come to my door, and the grocery delivery people are still going to come, and whatever I think of as essential is still going to happen. And so there is this. We are still interconnected. And I think stories, people will be left wondering more and wanting more theater. And maybe they'll watch more TV because TV can be great and film can be great and other books are great, right? But I think they'll want live.
The community. It might take us a year or more to get there again, but you're right. That's a great segue to sort of like open our Q&A question. We're going to do this for about 20 minutes or so. I'm going to start reading the first couple of questions. I encourage you, if you have a question and you want to say it out loud, to virtually raise your hand with the button of raising your hand, or easiest way, just write it in the Q&A section, and we will respond. So Charles says, hello, my name is Charles. First of all, I want to say thank you for this opportunity. I'm from Venezuela and I wrote a play. I have less than a year living here in Florida. I wanted to ask, what is the best way to find a way to produce a theater play and when you don't know a lot of people? Well, Charles, that is a very complicated question to respond. I think I'm going to take the lead on this because I am here in Florida. I think that things you can do is try to approach theater companies. There are a few of them, depending on if your show is in English or in Spanish, and just try to meet people and share your play. There really not that many festivals locally, at least you can compete. That would be a good segue. There might be some nationally that you can compete by sending. That's sort of like a way of getting some sort of recognition, third-party validation. Sometimes it's about bringing your friends together and just making it happen on a living room somewhere, and inviting a select group of people and then slowly growing it from there. No, David, what's your thought?
Yeah, I would agree with you. It's the other thing to do is see a lot of theater, because this is going to be about relationships, finding a connection here, and probably it's not something But when I was at Disney, the last 4 years, give or take, at the time I was there, I was a Tony voter. Right. Which there's 700 of them, and I was fortunate to be asked to be one. And you see 40 shows. Our rule was I'm not going to comment on a show that I didn't see.
Right.
And so while I had been very focused on things we had produced, then I got to see everything everyone was doing. And boy, did that, I met all sorts of people who I might not otherwise cross paths with. And I just saw like the whole range of stuff, right? So I had what I was trying to get done in my head, but then I got to see what everyone else was doing, and it totally opened my mind to how things get done in the real world. So that's my other thing is, if you want to make theater, you have to see a lot of theater.
Yes, that's it. See a lot of theater. It's always, and there are, now it's a tricky time because there's no theater. but it's a great moment. Listen, to take advantage of, for example, our next course will have Rogelio Martinez. It's free. It'll include exercise, so continue to work on your craft. We have a question here from Tamara saying, hello, David. My name is Tamara, and I do theater in Mexico. I love your presentation. I can see you have a very clear view on business in the American theater. I want to know if you know a little bit about how things are done in Mexico. We suffer so much. We work for free. People don't come to the theater, and we almost depend completely on government funding. Can you tell me a little bit about theater in the third world country? That's David's expertise. Lots of love. That's very nice to hear. Listen, I know a little bit about theater in Mexico. You do. So we have friends. We collaborate with theater companies like Por Piedad Teatro. They make and we've seen their plays in Mexico. There is actually an issue now, because before there was this way that companies can give directly to theater companies and deduct that from taxes, but the current government is changing that, and I know that is an issue of attention in the Mexican commercial theater scene. But yeah, but also, you work with Ocesa, right? They were the ones that were producing the big musicals, and it's a huge, Maurice Gilbert. That's a huge company, no?
Yes, part of a theater company, part of a bigger enterprise.
Right. They were bought out then by, right. So, I mean, yeah, theater in every country is different. I don't know if you have any more insight to say, David.
My experience there was with Beauty and the Beast running in Mexico City and with The Lion King running there. And so I have that slight different corporate mentality more than the earthy mentality of it. But I would say too, people thought it was unclear going into it whether or not either of those shows would be a big success in Mexico, right? But they were, and so there is at that level of something people are familiar with and expecting to see, and comes in as a success. People were willing to go and see it and pay for it. It was difficult to produce those shows, both of those shows there. I mean, there was a ton of local talent, but the production part taxed people because they're not used to dealing with all the stuff that was in the van when our team showed up. And that was some years ago now.
Right.
Too.
We have Michelle Garcia. This is great because she's writing from us from Puerto Rico. She said, "Hello, my name is Michelle. It's a very nice name. Thank you so much for this webinar. I'm a university student from Puerto Rico, and my question is, what advice can you give to people interested in becoming producers? What was your path to get to where you are?" Well, we heard a little bit of what your path, but what would you recommend somebody who wanted to be a producer?
The more typical path, I think, is for someone to start either in a general manager's office, because in the real world, the way most of the rest of commercial theater works is there's producers who are the lead decision maker and representing a group of investors, and a general manager who does all the day-to-day operation of the show. And a general manager's office, if you can get your foot in the door there, is a great way to see how it actually works, get the practical part of it. There are people who've apprenticed for producers. There are courses you could take that lead to kind of an apprenticeship where you can, Jack Vertel runs the one here that's sort of a seminar on all the things you need to know as a producer. So there's ways to learn it, and there's ways to work as a junior person in an office if you were so fortunate.
Right.
But I would go back to what you suggested on the playwright question is the other thing is just do it. Find a way to do it. Find a way, to offer your services to a local theater somewhere and actually get in and do it, because there isn't you can't go to university to be a producer. You kind of have to learn your way through it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And so any experience you could get would help build up your resume.
And I would say to Michelle, you're in Puerto Rico, try to contact Edgar Garcia. He used to work here in Miami before. He used to be at the university in Puerto Rico teaching. He's a great guy, dear friend, really smart, and great producer. So I think he's somebody really you should connect if you're in Puerto Rico, and I think that he really can probably give you wonderful advice about how to grow as a producer starting in Puerto Rico. We have a couple more questions. Chris Lari says, as a young and upcoming playwright, what is the best way to convince a producer theater that your production is worth the cost? I'm going to answer that. I think that the work speaks for itself. I think that there is no way on earth that a smart producer would have her hands on a piece of a play that she finds absolutely brilliant, compelling, and would not produce it. I think that the work speaks for itself. If your work is good, and again, I think it's about sharing your work. What David said before, knowing it's a network. It's human relationship. Go to other people's play, meet the people who are producing the work. Invite them for coffee, pitch your idea, and also don't get heartbroken. We, for example, I get to produce 4 shows a year. That's it, 4 shows a year. Most of them I commission myself. So we have very little room for it. And we have great people approaching us with ideas that we have to say no. And even ideas that we like, we can't commit the hundreds and thousands of dollars that we would want. You know, just think about you know, that it all needs to really rely on the work, concentrate on the work being spectacular, especially for playwrights. I do believe that there are great actors who would die unknown, but I bet you there is not a genius playwright who would die unproduced. If you are a great playwright, it's very easy to know that. So that's my, David, do you have anything to say to that?
I'm going to take the business side of it and say, what is that producer, or in your case, theater company, find the right match. If you're trying to shock people, break the mold, right? You could narrow down the field to some degree by saying, I've written work and it has these characteristics, and find the person who's more likely to do that. Because the public has a certain, you know, thing they're looking for, and yet another theater company in Arizona is going to have a different sort of view. So there might be a way to attack it. I think I can break anything apart and make steps out of it and make a battle plan.
So you're brilliant. You're absolutely right. There are some theater companies that are known to do new musicals. Some theater companies are known to do political works. And so, like, figure out, you know, that's such good advice. That's such good advice. If you can narrow it down, and you can, and I think that it's very easy to more or less understand the profiles of theater companies. And that's a really good, there's a lot of theater companies that just do new work. Just a lot of theater companies that they do female written new work. I mean, there is that network, and find a match. That's sound advice. All right. Lali says, is it possible to raise money in the US to produce shows outside, like Colombia? We have a powerful LGBT musical that it's hard to raise money in such a conservative country like ours. Do you think there'll be people willing to invest or donate? This kind of shows have a voice in the places where they need the most, where people don't talk about it, and it needs to be a conversation. It's a really interesting question. What do you think, David?
I think that's a difficult thing to do, but you have people who already have a connection, people who are from Colombia or their families from Colombia who live in the United States who probably are interested in theater, and that might be the first place I would try. Because in my head, I'm gonna, you know, there's 300 million people here. Who am I gonna go after? You gotta narrow it down somewhat. Go after the existing connection first, or maybe it's the LGBT angle, where you find someone who has been involved in a show like that in the US, and you say, yeah, you know, please explain to me, can I have a conversation with you about how you got that done? Because most people, if you take that angle and say, you know, you could find them on LinkedIn, or you could find them through theater connections, say, you know, I'm trying to do this thing and it's really quite hard, and I'd love to learn from your experience. They'll tell you a lot. And maybe you build a relationship with someone that way. That I'm always so tactical. What's my most fertile and then idea, but then probably the more connections you build, there'll be something that happens that you weren't expecting to happen. That's how these things, you know, you could, hand-to-hand combat's going to work to a certain point, but then something unexpected is going to happen, and maybe you do make a connection that way. I don't think that there's a marketplace for that I know of. There are theater festivals, and there's a new musical festival here that you could present work, but those people are looking to do something here, something in, you know, that they would invest in here. I don't know that there's a marketplace for what we're describing, but maybe there's a way to narrow that down too.
And also, listen, Colombia has the very important the Bogota Theater Festival, which is one of the you know, greatest theater festivals in the world. Mm-hmm. So that's interesting. And listen, and Jessica, our GM, says, "Hi, Lali, it's good to see you here. Also, there are some grants that partner internationally with companies to produce in one city outside of the U.S. and then inside the U.S. They can be complex, but Miami-Dade County ICE grant is one. It's funny. Probably ICE is the worst name you can have for a grant about, you know, things from another country coming into this country. But there you go.
That's what it is.
There's a Chicago Theater Festival that brings international word around, et cetera, international culture exchange. All right, international culture exchange. That's what ICE means. All
I
right.
like that one better.
Yeah, me too. Let's not abolish that ICE. So we have here our extraordinary board chair of Miami New Drama, the great Mr. David Charlin, is asking a couple questions. One, why can't nonprofit theater companies operate under a framework in which a show pays for itself, exclusive of G&A? What's G&A, David?
General administrative sort of overhead.
Oh, all right. Exactly. Outside of, and the second question is, if somebody wanted to make a tax deductible donation to your company, how would they go about doing that? Well, two very board chair-ish questions. David is saying, like, why can't your place make money? Coño. No, but I think our aim is a little bit to do that, right? That the shows sort of an idea. I mean, a way of looking at it is that maybe shows can sort of pay more or less for itself, and all the money that is raised, it's raised to the general operation of the company. I mean, in reality, Miami New Drama, we unfortunately, our shows cost like $300,000 and typically, make 200,000. So we always lose. I mean, there's shows like the Cubans that probably match what they cost. But it's a very dangerous to budget, thinking that all shows were going to cover their costs, right? But the important question from David is, where can you donate if you're excited about Miami Drama and understand that we're in a complicated situation? Colony.org. Colony.org is our website. You can go through miaminewdrama.org, but colony.org is sort of like our main website, and there's a donate now button. And it's really easy to click. People should try. Just you press a button and you click and you can make a donation. Do you have anything else to add, dear?
Well, when we saw, looking at the big picture of not-for-profit theater, 1.4 million in ticket sales matched by 1.3 million in contribution in support. Part of the reason that has sort of settled into a necessity and an equation is because you're asked, as the person operating this enterprise, and you're trying to program at least 4 or 5 different things, and you're worried about next season, you're just not going to get it 100% right all the time. It might happen where something sells better than you think, but your level of risk is greater because you only have you and Nick and people who are focused on production. So unlike when I was operating, working for a producer, there were people who were subject matter experts in everything, and they had time to really study and really respond and really get it right. You don't have that luxury. So you need a foundation, so to speak, that takes a little bit of that risk offset financially so that you can take more creative risks.
Right.
So you can say, across these 4 shows, I don't really know if people are going to respond to this one, but I'm doing it anyway. And we're going to see, right? I'm going to do this one that's probably a little unconventional, maybe a little expensive, or has some Viva la Parranda, you have to house all those people, like that has its own unique thing. And then I'm also going to do a show that's to balance that off, that's mostly about one lead character.
Right.
Somewhere in your season, right? You're going to try to balance all those things, but economically, you're so close to the margin in delivering a $300,000 show against what you think you can expect to get in ticket sales. You have no financial margin for error there. So the only way you would even approach those things is if you knew that you had support. You knew you had something to fall back on.
Right.
Financially, right? Otherwise, the engine just wouldn't run. You couldn't get up and running to do that. Does that make sense?
I think it does. So we have a couple more questions. We have a question that somebody put in the chat that I'm going to read because it's an interesting one. It's having started in commercial theater and now being involved with nonprofit. In what ways do you think either could be better informed by the other's model? It's a really good question, Gregory.
That is a good question.
And I'm eager to hear the answer.
Well, I'm going to start with something that doesn't work any longer, right? The other way that not-for-profit theaters used to offset their risk was by creating a subscription Commercial producers can't do that because they're focused on one show.
Right.
So everything is a one-off, and there's no institutional learning. In, you know, one producer gets a huge hit, and then everyone thinks they're a genius, and the next thing they do comes about in a different time frame. And of course, they're not going to create the same success they just created yesterday. They might, a few did, but as with many great novels and works of art, there are a great number where someone got one thing exactly right and it took off and they were fantastic. But their tendency, other than like Cameron Mackintosh or Andrew Lloyd Webber, they had multiple hits, right? They kind of could take learning from one place and put it somewhere else. But most of the time what happens is that whole group of people, creatives, performers, the finance people, the whatever, they all come together and they work on one thing and then they all come apart. Right? Many of them come apart before the thing is really even up and running. The writers have moved on to something else. The people who designed the scenery don't usually get to see that many performances because they're working on some other project. So it all comes apart. You lose that institutional knowledge. So commercial theater could benefit from more institutional knowledge. I happen to work in a place that had lots of it. The downside of it is you start thinking you're smart and you stop questioning your assumptions. So we constantly had to say,
the Little Mermaid happened.
Is that right? You got to get out of that, right? But that's something that not-for-profit has that is missing. But the thing that it used to benefit from was having a subscription audience where you know your audience and you kind of have a sense of what they expect and what would challenge them, and you could have at least some of your tickets pre-sold. That world does not really largely, it's an exception if somebody can build that at this point.
Right. And listen, even also Miami New Drama, we're not even trying that hard because that model really is, it's not a model that it's sort of compatible with like the Netflix era of just like choose something at whatever time you want to see whatever you want. You know, subscription models have that you know, bygone era already feeling, but it's extremely, like even our small subscription base, it's extremely informative to us.
True. And those people you can kind of have a relationship with,
right?
And they're a little more forgiving because they've already committed they're going to see 4 things, so they don't have all the expectations loaded onto each title. But since you don't have that, what commercial theater does have is they're very focused on a target audience.
Right. They know who their audience is and they know how to get that audience.
And they listen to them. And one of the greatest things about the theater is that you can see the customer. You can see how they act. You can see how they respond. You can see whether they commit. You can see whether they tell other people. Now with social media, you can tell if your audience is out there selling the show for you. It was the greatest experience I ever had, right? You can see the audience because the people who make shows that air on Netflix don't get that experience.
They don't. They sure don't. Well, they go to Twitter, and then there's all the memes about Joe Exotic.
Yes. So they can see that the publicity part, right? But they don't see someone's face when they're committing, and they don't see them leave the theater. One of the greatest experiences I've ever had at Disney was leaving. Mary Poppins was hard to do. It's a hard show. And we had a partner who had lots of opinions, and Cameron Mackintosh, really super smart. We did it with them. They did it in Bristol and took it to London. It was not as successful as everyone thought it would be. Nobody totally understood that, but we were already committed to do it in Broadway in the New Amsterdam Theater. And it was very hard and almost slightly defeating in a way. Like, why isn't this a beautiful show? It's my favorite thing that I worked on while I was there, the show itself. Why isn't this taking off? I don't know why. And there were lots of reasons that we figured out, you know, what would make it sell better, what would connect with people. But when I was down, I left the theater usually about 8 o'clock at night. But there happened to be an audience loading out by the time I was leaving. And it's a dad and a mom and a kid. And the kid, who's like 13, like that age where you're not quite sure whether you're going to make this connection or not. And he says it's the best night of my life, right? To his parents. And they're so excited. They got something good done. They're having this connection with their kid that I thought, okay, you know, my job is done. Like that, if you can get one person to have that response, you know you did something right. And watching the audience is so important. You got to know who's coming in the building. And in some cases, you might think you know, but then you get a different audience. And so then you have to sort of move how you're talking over here to where they are. But that is something that commercial theater has that sometimes you might not have time.
Right.
On that, right? You're worried about the next thing and the next thing by the time you're seeing who's coming. But that, pay attention to who your customer is, because your customer will tell you if you're going to be successful or not.
And you've been really good about that to us, and in fact that's why I did my zip code analysis and all the stuff that I've been doing since there, because I became a geek of it. We have the last question from Margot. I think it's like the correct question to end this. I'm at awe of your brilliance, David. Margot, that is two of us. And thank you so much for sharing your life and knowledge. With the uncertainty we are all facing in the theater world, from audience, social distancing, seating, and new way to keep your actors and crew safe until we have a vaccine, how do we, in the smaller markets, survive and find hope? How do we do it?
That's a tricky question, right? I mean, one thing that we have learned is I don't actually need all that much, curiously, right? We've been in this strange time when there was plenty, not across the entire board, but economy was pretty good. You didn't think so much about traveling. You didn't worry about this. And some segment was very interested in luxury. But when you shrink it back down, you don't actually need that much. And a good story well told in a room with a handful of people is still a story well told. I don't actually need the lighting and the sound equipment and the whatever.
Sure.
As a finance person thinking about theater, if you're telling me the show will only be successful if I have a helicopter, I need you to go read the script again, right? Because I don't want to count on all that stuff to sell you on the show. So there is a level at which theater can be done that's very simple and still effective. Some of the simplest things I ever saw were the most effective. So it isn't going to be about money necessarily when we come back. It's going to be about being together. The trick, as we're describing, I made this model and this is what's going to happen, and I'm going to be ready to respond when something doesn't happen, or ready to capitalize when something good happens, because that happens too. Sometimes something I didn't think was going to happen is good. The hard part here is this uncertainty of not knowing when I can make a plan. So I actually think you're right, Michelle, to assume that I cannot do this until 2021. And maybe you'll be pleasantly surprised that someone does come up with a solution. It's this or it's that or whatever. Wishing that's going to happen is not going to make it happen.
It's not going to make it happen.
So we got to be prepared. If I get a go, it means this, right? What could I do in the meantime? I could write, I can read, I can review, I can, establish relationships with people. I can do all these things so that I'm prepared. But it is tricky to just be in a holding pattern, right? That's the show. The curtain never goes up. Right. We're sitting there, anything could happen, and it never happens, which, I was reading back over my history of theater. Sure, theater survived lots of things like this, right? Big epidemic here, flu epidemic in 1918, theaters were all shut down and they came back. So we also have to just believe that it's going to be okay, which is hard to do.
Yeah.
But I mean, we've adapted and survived theater, lots of different things. So while it's difficult, we do have to have faith.
Well, we need to have faith. It's a great way of ending this wonderful conversation, David. Thank you so much. This was so informative. It was great questions from the audience. You really drew an extraordinary picture for us of what theater. It's interesting to sort of like see theater as a business from the distance, understanding the evolution of it, how we got where we are, categorizing the different music and the different eras and what that meant. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We are at awe and grateful to you. Please, for those still with us, we have Rogelio Martinez on Friday. I encourage you to sign up. It's going to be really exciting. And David, we're so lucky to have you. If everybody, come to see Miami New Drama Show. We're back, and you'll get a chance to meet David in person. especially on the first performance week.
I'm just excited someone wants to hear what I know about. I know a lot about a very limited number of things. So that was fun. Thank you so much. Good
Thank you very
conversation.
much. Thank you very much, my friend. I'll see you all very shortly.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.